and welcome to Sammy's Bookshelf. I'm Sammy and today I'm going to be discussing all the books that I read in July and giving you my spoiler-free thoughts. The first book that I read in July was The Red Scrolls of Magic by Cassandra Clare and Wesley Chu. If you didn't know, this book follows fan favourite couple Magnus and Alec, with each book in the trilogy being embedded in a different time in the Shadowhunter Chronicles. This book in particular is set after the events of City of Glass on Alec and Magnus's Europe vacation. But what was supposed to be a relaxing Europe vacation takes a turn for the worse when a seemingly harmless, mundane demon cult becomes dangerous, and Magnus may or may not have founded the cult hundreds of years ago. Recently, I have been rereading all the Shadowhunter books because as I was catching up on the Dark Artifices and the Last Hours earlier this year, it became increasingly apparent that I've forgotten an obscene amount of what happens in both the Mortal Instruments and the Infernal Devices. This, however, is not a reread. When I decided to embark on what I am calling the Great Cassandra Clare reread, I decided to slot these books in their chronological order as I read them so that I could read this for the first time where they actually take place in the whole big Shadowhunter series. This one, as I said, being set after City of Glass. I really enjoyed this book. It's really fun to go back to right to the beginning of Alec and Magnus's relationship, obviously knowing where they end up. Also makes me realize how great the character development in Cassandra Clare's books are, because looking back on how Alec used to be back in this book and knowing where he is at the end of Queen of Air and Darkness, I'm just so proud of him. He's come such a long way. And of course, Magnus is just his awesome self as always. I will literally enjoy anything that has Magnus in it. He's definitely one of my favourite book characters of all time. There was, of course, a lot of funny moments and funny dialogue like there is in any Shadowhunter book. We meet new characters and also come across some characters that we already know, but I won't go too in depth because obviously I don't want to spoil this book in case you haven't read it. It's also the first time during this reread of all the Shadowhunter books that we've encountered a bit more information on Magnus's past and his childhood and also who his father is. And it's always interesting to learn about Magnus's life because he's lived such a long one. Overall, I really enjoyed this book. I love anything Cassandra Clare writes. I gave this a 4 out of 5 stars on Goodreads. The next book that I read in July was the Heartbringer Trilogy by Jennifer L. Armentrout, which consists of Storm and Fury, Rage and Ruin, and also Grace and Glory, which I read as an ebook. If you don't know what this trilogy is about, this is a companion trilogy which takes place after the event of the Dark Elements trilogy. This book follows Zane, who we met in the Dark Elements series, and also a new character named Trinity. This book takes place in a world where gargoyles, who are called wardens, have been tasked with protecting humans from demons. I feel like if I already hadn't read so many Jennifer L. Armentrout series, I probably would have enjoyed this a lot more. When I read the Dark Elements, I think that was the second Jennifer L. Armentrout series I'd ever read, and I loved the characters. I thought the plot with the gargoyles being warriors was really unique, but there are a lot of aspects in this trilogy that are definitely not unique, very far from it. Trinity's personality was exactly the same as Layla's personality from the Dark Elements, whose personality was also the same as Katie from the Lux series, whose personality was also the same as Evie from the Origin series. It's just the same thing over and over again in all of Jennifer L. Armentrout's series. All I want is for Jennifer L. Armentrout to sit down and write a character that's actually unique and not the same character that I've seen 5 times before. That's all I ask. I'll be reading Jennifer L. Armentrout books and there are whole lines that have word for word been copied and pasted into each series, and every time I come across these phrases I'm just like like, there's only so many times that you can reference Supernatural. Reference a different show. Like, I don't want to hear any more about Sam and Dean. And Jennifer L. Armentrout, she has a really great writing style that I really love. All her books are told in first person as just one big inner monologue. Although, now that I'm thinking about it, kind of every book that's in first person is one big inner monologue. But Jennifer Armentrout just puts so much personality into it, and it really allows her sense of humour to shine. But it's also her detriment because it just showcases how Jennifer Armentrout's characters are all exactly the same. However, there is one thing that I really enjoyed about this book that does make Trinity more unique, and that is that she has a degenerative eye disease. So she is slowly going blind, and this aspect is actually in the blurb, and that's what made me want to pick up this book in the first place. Trinity has been trained all her life to fight, so it's very interesting to see how she trains and fights having already lost so much of her vision. And I feel like a big part of her development is her learning to be okay with being vulnerable and understanding and accepting that sometimes she's going to need help. It kind of reminds me of Toph from Avatar, she's right there. But it also doesn't define her character. She still has a lot of other traits about her that make her her. Unfortunately, those traits are also the same traits and bits of personality in every other Jennifer Armentrout book. I gave Storm and Fury a 3 out of 5 stars, Rage and Ruin a 2.5 out of 5 stars, and I also gave Grace and Glory a 2.5 out of 5 stars. Moving on, I read the Monsters of Verity duology by Victoria Schwab, which consists of This Savage Song and Our Dark Duet. These books were fantastic. This was my first adventure into Victoria/V.E. Schwab, and I was definitely not disappointed. I'm super keen to read her other books now. I know The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue is blowing up right now, but I'm also really keen to read A Darker Shade of Magic. This duology is an urban fantasy set in the fictional city of Verity. In this world, violent acts breed monsters. So if someone murders someone else, from the carnage of that violent act, a monster appears. And Verity is a very violent city, so it is completely overrun with these monsters. And there are 3 types of monsters in this world. There are Korsai, Malkai, and Sunai. The city of Verity is also split in the middle. Callum Parker rules the north side of the city, and he is able to protect you from the monsters for a fee, and he's the one who tried to overthrow Henry Flynn, who leads the south side of Verity, and he leads in a more democratic way. The book has 2 main characters, Kate Harker and August Flynn. Kate Harker is the daughter of Callum Harker, and August Flynn is the adoptive son of Henry Flynn. August is also a monster. He is a Sunai, and he has the ability to reap the souls of those who have sinned by playing music. Something that I really loved about this series was the characterization of our 2 main characters. We have Kate, who is obviously the son of this really horrible man, and everyone just assumes that because of this she is a monster. And she uses that to her advantage. She plays that role to get what she wants, and she also wants to prove to her father that she is ruthless enough to be the next leader of the north side of Verity after her father. But then you have August, who is technically a monster. He's a Sunai, but he so desperately wants to be human, so much so that he practices his human facial expressions in the mirror. And he delays reaping souls, which acts as sustenance for him because he doesn't want to be ruled by that monster side of him. So these characters are literally the exact opposite of each other. Although to be fair, she may not have done that on purpose. That could just be me creating significance where there is no significance. But either way, I think it's very clever. And so when they come together and have to work together, their conversations and how they interact is so interesting and so much fun to read. Structurally, this book is fantastic. The world building is great, and there's also a smidge of romance. If you're a fan of urban fantasy, I highly recommend this duology. I gave This Savage Song a 4.5 out of 5 stars, and I gave Our Dark Duet a 5 out of 5 stars. I then had a bit of a genre shift, and the next book I picked up was The Lucky List by Rachel Lippincott. This book follows a girl named Emily whose mother has passed away 3 years prior to the start of this novel. Her father can no longer afford for them to keep living in their house, so they have to move, and they get help from his father's high school friends and his daughter Blake. and as Emily and Blake are packing up her mother's things, they find a bucket list of things her mother did in the summer before her senior year, and Blake has the idea that Emily should try and complete every activity on the list so she can feel closer to her mother. This book heavily focuses on Emily's identity. Before the death of her mother, Emily was very adventurous, she was a risk taker, and now after her death, she is very much the opposite, always wanting to keep things on the safe side. It's about Emily trying to find the girl who she was before her mother's death, but also trying to figure out who she is now after her death and the kind of person she wants to be. This was such a great contemporary read. It'd be a great book obviously to read in the summer. Of course, I read it in the middle of winter, but that's besides the point. Definitely the highlight of this book for me was the romance between Emily and Blake. Obviously, they start to form feelings for each other as they complete all the activities on the list. The romance always felt really natural and never felt rushed, which just goes to show how well Rachel Lippincott constructed this book, because this is a very short book. It's less than 300 pages, but in no way was it ever like, whoa, this is going too fast. It was always just the perfect pace. Rachel also did a really wonderful job of depicting how teenagers actually act and how they speak. I've read so many books where the author is obviously older and she's trying to write teenagers and they try to use slang and that kind of humor, and it just falls very flat and it's very cringy. But Rachel did a very, very good job of depicting these characters really realistically. This book in a lot of ways reminds me of Since You've Been Gone by Morgan Matson with The List, but this is very much a sadder version of that book. It had that same nervousness and excitement and anticipation as she completes every item on the list. Actually, when I was reading this, I realized that the protagonists in both this book and Since You've Been Gone have the same name, so that's interesting, I guess. If you're looking for a book that's a really fun, fast-paced contemporary, I would definitely read this one. I highly recommend it. I gave it a 4.5 out of 5 stars. The very last book that I read in July was another contemporary, and that was The Problem with Forever by Jennifer L. Armentrout. I'm not going to go too into depth into this book since I filmed a whole spoiler and spoiler-free review of it, which you can watch right now. But to keep it short and sweet, this is about a girl named Mallory who has been in the foster care system. She spent many years in a very abusive household, with her only companion being a boy named Ryder who also lived in the house with her. They eventually are able to escape the abusive household, but they get separated, and years later, after years of being homeschooled, Mallory goes back to public school for her senior year and she reunites with Ryder. There were aspects of this book that I really enjoyed and also things that I really didn't enjoy. I really liked Mallory's development in this book and her recovery from being in the abusive foster home and learning to find her voice. There were some well-written scenes and I really liked the development of Ryder's character as well, but something I didn't like was the romance. I felt it was too rushed. It didn't feel like a natural development. I gave this book a 3 out of 5 stars. So that was all the books that I read in the month of July. I hope you enjoyed this video and I'll see you later. Bye!